still, Hoover has important ideas there because there are anti-reductionist strategies, and Hoover uses some of them, but I think he doesn't bring them to full clarity. There are several anti-reductionist strategies, some of which Hoover seems to have in mind because he believes in an autonomous, non-eliminable in principle macroeconomics. You find that this is really what drives him. You see, he tries to argue for an autonomous macroeconomics. But Hoover's arguments for the in-principle ineliminability of macroeconomics are hard to understand. Also those that I'm not dealing with here in other articles is really hard to understand, and I know that from other areas to argue in principle against reduction is very, very hard. It's very complicated what sort of arguments one can put forward. In practice, the question of the in-principle eliminability of some fields is often irrelevant. So if you ask whether a reduction is in practice impossible, or whether it's only in practice impossible, no, only in principle impossible, but in practice also impossible, that's irrelevant. If you can't do it in principle or in practice, then scientists won't care. Right? If I, as a sociologist, say, well, sorry, I can't reduce that to psychology, you're not further interested whether in principle that's impossible or only in practice. If the in practice is such that for the next 20 years you can't do it, right? Then you say, well, it's not possible, so forget it, right? So that is sometimes important in philosophy. The question may be interesting. I put here a maybe instead of is, if you look at the slides. For instance, when you say, is biology reducible to physics and chemistry? Then the question behind is that, what sort of phenomenon is life? Is life something which is really not really fundamentally different from behavior of dead matter? Or is life something that's fundamentally different from matter not alive, such that biology cannot be reduced in principle? Right? There it makes a difference whether it's only in practice not reducible, but in principle, then you would say, then life is just a purely physical, chemical phenomenon. It's not something fundamentally different. But if it's in principle not reducible, you would say, well, then life is in principle a different phenomenon from the rest of physics and chemistry. And if you are interested in that question, what sort of phenomenon is life? Or human consciousness, for instance. If you say, well, is that a phenomenon, human consciousness, that's in principle really reducible to neural activity? What is the consensus in neuroscience these days? Then you'd say, well, even consciousness is, in the end, a material phenomenon. It's nothing really different. So if you want to ask questions about what's the nature of life or what's the nature of human beings, then you are interested in these in-principle questions. But they do not play a role in science itself. You may be interested in them. You may get or may not get answers then in philosophy. So, but it's important to see that in practice, these in-principle questions are just not interesting. Now, let's see what sort of strategies there are in order to argue if you are an anti-reductionist and you want to argue your anti-reductionism. So, for instance, for Hoover, who says, yeah, I don't believe it that macroeconomics can be ever reduced to microeconomics. It's different, it's autonomous. And so what are the arguments? There are three important strategies, and they are relevant in Hoover. So, the first strategy, and that's also very, very, very general, is often fueled by an apparent heterogeneity of the two domains. There is an unbridgeable conceptual gap that is assumed. So you say, you want to reduce this one to that area, that's impossible. This is conceptually so different, it's impossible to reduce that. Right? This is very often, so you say in the 19th century, people said, what life, look at life, is so different from everything else, from non-life, it's impossible to reduce life to non-life. That's absolutely impossible. You have that. So for instance, in biology, I must have read that, yeah. Phenomena of life are utterly different from behavior of dead matter, therefore reduction of biology to physics and chemistry is impossible. This is an argument of that kind. And you have a similar argument in Hoover, where he says, macroeconomics is supposed to come up with causal regularities. He calls it billiard ball regularity, right? Like a causality. When a billiard ball hits another ball, then there's a causal, it's cause and effect. And he says this you want to have in macroeconomics. But if you look at the micro level, then intentionality plays a role. And that is so fundamentally different. And it's impossible to construct out of intentionality of individual actors to construct something that's purely causal at the macro level. Look, this is conceptually so far apart, it's impossible to build a bridge that you can reduce this causal billiard ball causality of the macro level to the intentionality of the micro level. This is the sort of argument, and he uses that sort of argument. You find it again everywhere, where you simply say, look, the phenomena are so different of this level, they cannot be possibly reduced. Yeah, but causality of the macro level can hardly be recaptured by the intentionality of the micro level. However, for instance, in physics, thermal phenomena look utterly different from mechanical phenomena, but a reduction is at least partly possible. So we do have experience in the sciences where this sort of argument, that can't be possible that this is reducible, and finally it was possible. So if you look at thermal phenomena, I mean, they are so different from mechanical things, but it turned out in the 19th century that you can understand thermal phenomena in terms of mechanical phenomena. Right? So roughly, very, very, very roughly speaking, that heat is just the agitation, is the kinetic energy of molecules, right? And they're conceptually apparently so far apart, but then one found steps to understand that. So it's a very tricky argument, and it's potentially very fallacious, that you get the impression, this is so far apart, they can't be reduced, and then you find intermediate steps and they can be reduced. So this is a very, very, very critical argument. It's relevant in this context and often occurring ambiguity. So for instance, when he says there is a conceptual chasm between the microeconomic analysis and the macro analysis, this is of course right, there is a conceptual chasm, but there is a difference between claiming that the reduction is in principle impossible or that is exceedingly complex, right? At least from a philosophical point of view, that makes a difference. For the practitioner, it doesn't make a difference, as I said, right? You say, well, it's not doable, fine, okay. Also in relevant disciplines, so just pointing out that there is this chasm, and I can't imagine how there could be a reductionist bridge. Yeah, if you can't imagine, fine with you, but that's not an answer to the argument. And it may be exceedingly complex, fine, but that's something else than claiming it's in principle not possible, right? Even if that difference is not important in science itself, typically. The exceeding complexity is often obvious, but the in principle non-reducibility is mostly extremely hard to argue. I once had a research project in which I tried to find out what the possible arguments are for the in principle non-reduction. And it's very hard to come up with really good arguments because they are impossibility arguments. And impossibility arguments are very, very thorny. And it's very difficult to come up with. In mathematics, it's okay, but not in empirical science. Okay, so this is tricky. This is really tricky. And if you look at the last few hundred years in science, then you see, well, be careful with that strategy. Now comes the second strategy, also used here and also used in other areas. I know it from biology, also I know it from thermodynamics, and that argument goes the following. So we start, for the reduction, we have this upper level and the lower level, and then someone who doesn't like that, he says, the two levels in question cannot clearly be separated, right? You just argue that the presupposition for the whole reductive enterprise isn't given, namely the clear separation, right? And you argue in the following way. So because the micro level cannot be described without elements from the macro level, right? This is, you may remember, this is the argument by Hoover. And the two levels are entangled such that a proper question of reduction of macro to micro cannot really be posed, right? Because you presuppose for reduction that the levels can be separated, right? The whole body can be separated from the organs. It's something else. And then you can say, can I reduce the function of the whole body to the function of the organs? Or can I, if you can't separate that, you cannot ask the question, right? So it's one way of subverting the reductionist question by saying you're asking the wrong question, right? You're presupposing the two levels can be separate, but they cannot. And you find this argument in Hoover. There in roughly Microeconomics depends on macroeconomics because the choices of individual agents are also influenced by, for instance, the expectations regarding macroeconomic variables or by the economic inequality of the society. That's basically an element from the Lucas critique, right? You say what the individuals do depends on the macro level, so they are not independent, so it doesn't make sense to ask the question of reduction. And this is what he uses here. Now, this is also a strategy you find, for instance, in biology, where you say, there's an argument, Wilson, a famous sociobiologist, has articulated something very similar, which is basically you cannot even separate the levels, and therefore the whole question of reduction is ill-posed. Now, the objection about the argument of Hoover is this. It's not the macro level itself that is involved in the individual choices, but it is the individual beliefs about it, and this is something else. It's not the unemployment rate itself, but it's the belief in the unemployment rate and its change in the future that makes the difference, or the behavior of the stock market. It's not the stock market itself, it's the belief. So what happens there, it is legitimate, even necessary, to include these beliefs on the micro level. Otherwise, the characterization of the processes at the micro level would be incomplete. Right? If you describe the micro level, you must have all the components of the micro level. So if the individuals at the micro level believe X, Y, Z, then of course you must know what these people believe in order then potentially to reduce the macro level to the micro level. But the beliefs about the macro level is not the same as the macro level. It's beliefs about them, right? And the beliefs are just individual beliefs of people. So it's not the macro level itself that's involved, it's the beliefs about them. And trivially, an incomplete characterization of the micro level always make reductions of the macro level trivially impossible. So if you say, I'm not allowed to use these beliefs, then forget it. Then, of course, it's trivial that that is not possible. That the beliefs of the actor are about the macro level does not entangle the levels in such a way that the asymmetric separation of the two levels is impossible. Micro is different and determines macro. That's still the same. Right? Even if at the micro level people have beliefs about the macro level, it's still something else. Macro is aggregation of micro, right? And independent, and insofar independent, and there's no entanglement such that the question of can I reduce macro to micro doesn't make sense anymore. That doesn't exist. And there he's just, I think, a little sloppy. We saw the same, we didn't see, I used it earlier in earlier classes. You see the same, that sometimes in economics people don't make the difference. Oh, I used it when I discussed Horstmann's model, right, with the constraints. It's one thing what the beliefs of constraints do, that's different from what the constraints themselves do, right? If you believe there is a constraint that you cannot travel to North Korea, that determines your behavior. It's not the restrictions that are there, it's your belief that's there. Only when you try to travel to North Korea, then it's not your belief that's relevant, but the real constraints. So there's always the difference. Also with the models, right? In many models where you have full, complete information and true information, that you don't feel that in the models. But as soon as someone has a false belief, then it looks, for instance, like preference reversal and all that. So it's very important, sometimes it's important to make that difference, what is belief and what is the thing that is believed in. And an additional note here, but that's only in passing, a reductionist strategy does not exclude the fruitful interaction of levels. So you start with an hypothesis on the macro level, you try to understand it from the micro level, discover that it needs correction, and then you correct it, and then you try to understand H star from the micro level, discover that it needs correction, etc. And then you have something like an interplay between the levels, but the reductionist impulse is nevertheless always the same. You want to understand the composite system in terms of the parts, even if that is a strategy here, or dynamics. That happened in physics, for instance. So, and finally, there is also that strand of argument is also in Hoover. There are laws or regularities of the macro level for which a reduction to the micro level is useless. You know, his simple machines, and that he insinuates also for economics, right, for macroeconomics. The source of inspiration is an example by philosopher Hilary Putnam, and that's a very good one. It's the square peg and round hole. You probably don't know what a peg is. This is a peg, right? The round hole is there, and the idea is this, that peg has a certain size, and the hole has a certain size, and then you ask, can that go through it, right? Did you see it's nice, isn't it, this little arrow here? Here, can it go through it? And the going through condition is, if you need a little mathematics, is this one by Pythagorean theorem. And the reduction to the micro level would be in covering the molecular basis of the solidity of peg and hole, right? The question whether it goes through is purely geometrical, right? If it's solid stuff. And there the question, I mean, where does the solidity come from, is irrelevant for the question whether the peg goes through the hole or not. It's just useless, right? You don't need it. You just need it. Oh, it's solid material. The molecular realization of solidity is very different for wood, steel, glass, ceramics, etc., but irrelevant. This is the kind of example that Hoover has in mind, with his physics of simple machines, or with macroeconomics. You have so stable relations on the macro level that the question about micro reduction doesn't recover any additional information. It's just irrelevant. You don't need it. And that's the third anti-reductionist strategy. A science of pegs and holes, and they're going through conditions, would gain nothing from being reduced to the micro level. Just nothing. It's not what you're interested in. You're interested, do these pegs go through the holes, and there you need solidity and geometry. It lives entirely from geometry and the macroscopic property of solidity, like Hoover's physics of simple machines. Due to the macroscopic property of solidity, the causal relations are obvious, and the real question is macroeconomics really similar to this case? And this is what Lucas and others and most people doubt. Okay? Are there robust macroeconomic causal laws with known intelligible limitations such that a third for macrofoundations of those laws would obviously be useless? And that's the core of the Lucas critique. And this is at least suggested by parallels to other sciences, that understanding the upper level regularities in terms of the lower level mechanisms makes sense. And it seems to me that Hoover's arguments are not fully convincing. Okay, thank you very much. Next time we start with the next section.